This is the gist on Strat News Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. Great to be joined from Moscow again by Dr. Maxim A. Suchkov. He's the director of the Center for Advanced American Studies and associate professor at the Department of Applied International Analysis at MGIMO. That's the Moscow State Institute of International Relations or Moskovsky Государственный институт международных отношений. Dr. Suchkov, thank you so much for giving us time on Strat News again. Dobry večer.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's good to be with you.
About the foreign minister's visit now, of course, they're preparing for President Putin and Prime Minister Narendra Modi's summit, which didn't happen last year. Both sides say it was because of the pandemic. But there was a bit of a Freudian slip from our minister early on in his statement when he meant to say that India-Russia ties are time-tested, even though that's a cliche, and he said India-US ties. But that apart, how do you see the build-up to this annual summit that should be held sometime this year?
Well, I think there's a greater appreciation in the Russian foreign policy making community and in the Russian leadership in particular that India and actually that part of the world is getting the center stage. And India in particular is going to play a tremendously important role. So I imagine there'll be even more these kinds of outreaches between and engagements between Russian and Indian counterparts. You mentioned the Freudian slip of the Indian foreign minister. I think it's no coincidence, of course, that Lavrov's visit kind of comes after a major tour of American policymakers in India. Needless to say, and I think that's very much a view here in Moscow, that we're kind of in entering the new era in the international relations with this new kind of Cold War between the United States and China. If I had to make a metaphor, even though it's a terribly flawed historic analogy, India perhaps would play a role of what Germany played during the Cold War. Incredibly important state, has some complicated relations with one party, China in particular, but nonetheless it has a tremendous strategic importance both to Beijing and Washington and to Russia. And I think there is also this view in Moscow that we're coming to increased technological bipolar world, and that state of affairs is neither in the interest of Russia and India. And there is even this concept of Russia and India making this, and of course as discussed at the policy expert community, not so much at the policy making level, that Russia and India can be kind of leading members of the quote-unquote new non-technological non-alignment movement, kind of the countries that don't really want to be under the technological dominance of the United States or China.
When you talk about China now, Russia has a strategic partnership with India, special and privileged with India, strategic partnership with China as well. When there was a lot of tension and there were even deaths on both sides, on the Indian and Chinese side, when there were clashes in Galwan, there was a lot of questioning within India among a certain strata of strategic analysts about what kind of relationship was Russia having, if it could have its leg on both sides of the fence, so as to speak. How is it looked at in Moscow? How do you balance this relationship, especially when two of your best friends, time-tested friends, are at loggerheads?
Well, I think Foreign Minister Lavrov referred to it in his remarks with the Indian counterpart, talking about Russian mediation efforts or some vision that Moscow proposed to both New Delhi and Beijing in terms of how to mitigate this conflict. Well, I think what was also very important is that Lavrov stressed, quote-unquote, unacceptance of any third-party involvement. To me, it was a clear reference to the United States trying to kind of use this conflict to put more pressure on China and kind of engage India in its own strategy of containment China. That I think is a kind of a very undesirable scenario for Moscow and Russia. I think you can see from Russia's movements in the Middle East, in particular, is very careful about not taking any side between any rival parties. Right. This is one of the reasons I think why Russia still manages to keep a balanced relationship with both either Israel and Iran, right, or with Turkey and the Kurds and rivalries like this. So I think the Indian-China spat, as it is assessed in Moscow, is a very unfortunate development, and it will be even a more unfortunate development if it is used by the United States for its own kind of interests and reasons. And Russia's idea is that it is between New Delhi and Beijing to settle, but Russia is happy to provide some mediation efforts even when asked for it.
Right. In fact, the ministers of both sides, our foreign minister and Wang Yi, and our defense minister and the Chinese defense minister, actually face to face for the first time. They met on the sidelines of the SCO in
Mhm.
Moscow when all that tension was there. Another issue that comes up often between India and Russia, at least it's discussed, is the Indo-Pacific. So I just want to play out part of the statement of our External Affairs Minister Shankar when he was asked about the concept and what it really meant in terms of trying to dovetail what India's perception is and what Russia's is.
Shared our viewpoint on the Indo-Pacific, as our Prime Minister pointed out at the Shangri-La dialogue some years ago. Contemporary challenges require countries to work together in new and different ways. Such cooperation also reflects the multipolar and rebalanced character of global politics. India is strongly committed to ASEAN centrality, and this is underlined by the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative that it has been advocating at the East Asia Summit. As we implement our Act East and Beyond policy, Russia is a very important partner, whether it is the Far East or whether it is the Chennai-Vladivostok corridor. In addition, of course, there was the larger backdrop of global political changes that provided a context for our talks today.
Dr. Suchkov, now you were
Mhm.
mentioning what for Mr. Lavrov twice. I think once in January last year when he was in Delhi, he talked about the Quad and the Indo-Pacific, and then at the RIIC, where our foreign ministry, which is very unusual, had to make a statement that India's foreign policy is independent. It's not, you know, pushed into a corner by the U.S. against China. But the what used to be called the Asia Pacific, what is now called the Indo Pacific, how does Russia view it, especially when India is trying to include Russia in this so-called inclusive, not anti anybody relationship, even though there is the Quad, which Russia certainly has a problem with, apart from China.
Sure. Well, I think we have to, especially for your listeners, we have to make clear that there should be a distinction between the how the official Moscow views the Indo-Pacific concept, and it very much looks at it through the lens of kind of U.S. proposed and kind of moved forward initiative. And you mentioned Quad, and definitely these kind of vision that the United States promotes of the Indo-Pacific very much centered around containing China and building an alliance within this Quad to contain China. And that, of course, is kind of unacceptable, as Moscow sees it. And therefore, whenever the Indo-Pacific concept is mentioned, it produces sort of a knee-jerk reaction from Moscow to say, no, it's a terrible idea. We shouldn't be framing it in these terms because it ultimately promotes the American view. Within the policymaking community in Russia, there is a more nuanced view that says, well, look, first of all, the Indo-Pacific concept was proposed by India itself, and then it was kind of hijacked by the United States for its own reasons. So if we are to promote what Lavrov and the other members of the Russian leadership talk about as the polycentric world, where India is to play a very important role, we have to really kind of decouple these two elements and say this Quad initiative and the view that the Americans are promoting is unacceptable, but that there is also kind of a genuine meaning of this concept that we should embrace and kind of propel India with in the region, and there are elements in this concept which Russia generally recognizes, such as this what I mentioned before, the centrality or the growing centrality of this region to the international affairs that Russia recognizes. So there is internal debate, which makes me more perhaps optimistic that with time the official Moscow will be more kind of nuanced in its understanding on the concept and will try to promote what was initially the Indian view of this concept and not the one that the Americans promoted.
Right, Dr. Sachkov, another part of the relationship, a big part, and it's talked very often, is the military cooperation and the S-400s, which we're expecting by September, October, I do believe. Maybe it's going to be timed with the annual summit. I'm not sure about that. But let's just listen into a question that a Russian journalist asked Sergei Lavrov on the S-400s. It was an interesting question. Let's just play that out. Just give us a sec.
The possibility of acquiring additional S-400 regiments from Russia, despite the threat of US sanctions. Спасибо.
Right. In fact, it wasn't me who stated that the US exercises pressure on India, but any other country that wants to sign agreements with Russia on the delivery of weapons or that has such contracts, the USA says this overtly. We all well know this, but we also know the reciprocal reaction, the response of India. We did not discuss these statements from the USA. Instead, we confirmed that we are going to deepen our military cooperation. We have Intergovernmental Committee on the Military Technical Cooperation that has its own plans. We also discussed the prospect of an additional manufacturing of the Russian military equipment in India within the concept made in India and within the concept of the independent India. So here, I didn't feel any fluctuations or changes from our Indian partners and friends.
Dr. Suchkov, so Mrs. Jaishankar also speaks on that, in fact,
we didn't
saying,
get into any specific
saying that they didn't discuss US sanctions or potential sanctions once the S-400s come. But how, in fact, is that seen? An interesting statement that he makes where we're looking at the potential for additional military equipment or systems to be manufactured in India, which is what India is also has a big project called Atmanirbhar Bharat, which is made in India. How do you see that as one card that Russia can use to further, strengthen relations, because that's what India wants, technology.
Sure, absolutely. And this is actually, if we project it to a broader scheme of things, the view in Russia is that there are a growing number of countries that see a greater strategic sovereignty from their relationship with the West. Turkey, the one that already purchased the S-400, India is another example. And to be strategically independent or sovereign from the West, you need to be sovereign in some of the key industries, including the military production. So the S-400 is an advanced defense missile system, right? And that's it's really one thing that any country that seeks security and defense capabilities needs. So basically, the Russian deal and why it is kind of popular among some nations is that not only Russia is willing to sell this system, but it's willing to co-share the production technology on the territory of that country, train officers of that country to manage this system. And this way, this country, and we're talking about India in this case, can build its own defense missile systems that will make it more kind of secure in the face of foreign threats. So that approach, of course, is not sitting well as Moscow sees with the United States, that wants countries to buy its own weaponry, but it does not always feel interested in sharing the production technology. And as I mentioned before, a growing number of states are more interested in the deal that the Russians are proposing, exactly because this deal is not just about selling hardware, but about kind of boosting some of the military technology on the territory of that country. Of course, it's basically the Russians have the offer. If the offer looks interesting for certain countries, India in our case, then the leadership of that country has to make this, again, strategic decision whether it wants to stand up to the pressure put by the Americans or not. Because ultimately, the only other opportunity is you give up on the Russian offer and end up with perhaps American or other Western country made system, but will not be able to create your own industry of this military technology.
Well, there is the possibility of a waiver from US sanctions also. And since you're talking about military cooperation and with third countries, the BrahMos supersonic missile is also one where
Mhm.
third countries have expressed desire: Philippines, Indonesia, in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, I think, as well, and the Gulf. So that's another area where India and Russia can move forward, right, Dr. Sutko?
Sure, I totally agree with you. And again, this before that's the case, say with Turkey, right? Turkey needed defense missile system. Then there was this threat of sanctions, and they actually imposed sanctions recently. But there is a big debate inside the United States whether Turkey is as important to American interests, so it can allow certain waivers. And I think similar debates will be and already unraveling in the U.S. whether India should be granted some waivers because it is such an important country and a larger kind of strategy of the United States.
Right. I mean, there's a question from one of our regular viewers and even commentator, Salvatore Bobones, who says, are there any countries where Russia would be unwilling to offer S-400 technology transfer? The questions are China, Pakistan, Turkey, the technology transfer, that is.
Well, that's a good question. I think that's the Russian military has to do a lot of careful assessment before making this decision and channeling their proposals to the Russian leadership. I can tell you, I'm not sure what the debates look like in terms of as far as Pakistan is concerned, but in case of Turkey, his historic, very complicated relations with that country, but the ultimate decision was made based on a few factors. One of them was that the Russia's own military is already purchasing and developing S-500, kind of a new generation system. Secondly, because of its co-production and also the export version of S-400, right? So it's basically not the same type of system that the Russian military operates. The export version tends to have some of the very sensitive classified technology, and these are the things that the Russians are not sharing. So I think it's very much country by country assessment.
A country by country assessment, there is a view that, which has been officially by Russia, that any armament to Pakistan is not happening. There are questions being raised among certain people in India, a certain section of analysts, which say, why was India and Pakistan's trips clubbed? Now, that could be just because of the situation, it's close by. It's not necessarily a message to India. How is it seen in Moscow, Dr.
Excuse me, are you referring to these latest talks on what situation?
For Mr. Lavrov now traveling from here to Pakistan?
Yes. Well, basically, again, that's what I referred to earlier. Is Russia is trying to be delicate in its approach when dealing with countries that have distinct kind of rivalries or difficult relations. So basically, you see, even again, as you take a kind of a handbook, a manual of Russian diplomacy in the Middle East, whenever you have top-level visits to Iran, you will have certain kind of asymmetry of visits or of engagement with Israel, and so on and so forth. Like if there is a contact with the Syrians, then there is a contact with Turkey, making sure that there is no perception at the public level that this fine balance is tipped to any party. Obviously, relations with India, in my view, have a broader agenda, broader kind of trade over, even though in terms of numbers, the trade turnover with Pakistan was on the rise in the pandemic, mostly because of the wheat exports, and on the decline in terms of India. But in absolute numbers, no comparison. And before pandemics, the trade turnover with India was 11 billion, whereas with Pakistan was a little over half a billion. And there is a broader agenda with India, I think, and in Pakistan. If you look at the press release of the Russian Foreign Ministry, the most of the discussion is about counterterrorism situation in Afghanistan, some joint projects in Pakistan, and also a gas pipeline from Karachi to Lahore, if my memory serves me right. But the challenge for Russia, of course, is that it's really hard to compete with the Chinese investments in Pakistan. So this idea that the Russian companies can be extremely successful in Pakistan, given this competition with Chinese companies, I think it makes it more difficult. So I would say there is a very tailored agenda in case of Pakistan, whereas with India, it's a kind of a broader strategic significance. But then again, I'm saying this as a public policy expert, right? And I can perhaps make these remarks, but you will not perhaps want to receive the same sentiment or the same perception if you are a Russian official, especially a foreign minister, making sure that one country gets more attention and credit than the other one.
Both the ministers talked about Afghanistan in their talks. Now, that's one issue where Russia has been involved a lot. Again, there was a perception in India that, when the Troika plus 1+1 happened, and the Taliban was also called, that India was not invited, and both countries had to issue public statements saying they were different fora, etc. How do you see Afghanistan in terms of India-Russia relations? There is a difference in both treatment and perception of what's happening in that country.
Sure, of course. During the press conference, Foreign Minister Lavrov kind of provided an official explanation, right, saying that India was not part of that format, but it is a part of the Moscow platform. So it's kind of different things. The kind of unofficial explanation was that in that latest meeting in Moscow, which will, same type of meeting will be held in Turkey soon, was among the countries that have relations or engaging with both the Taliban and the government. And the view is that since India is more engaged with the official Afghan government and lesser so to the Pakistan, Indian participation in that particular case was not kind of on the agenda. I think in terms of Pakistan, there is a view that, in terms of Afghanistan, of course, now I'm making this Freudian slip, right? And I mean it because there is a perception that Pakistan obviously plays a greater role in terms of their relations with the Taliban. But what happens in Afghanistan is of tremendous importance to India in terms of security. We'll remember all this, bloody terrorist attacks and atrocities that took place on the Indian territory, and it has this huge, this is kind of built into idea of a joint security. Because if Afghanistan is unstable, Russia's Central Asia will be unstable. Russia's, what Winston Churchill back then called Russia's soft underbelly, referring to the Russian kind of southern border, will be unstable, and it will project a lot of instability to India. So it's very much in the interest of all the countries surrounding Afghanistan to play a constructive role and make sure that Afghanistan is more or less stable. So far, I think there is this understanding in Moscow that you can't really do things without some kind of engagement with the Taliban. So you have this situation where officially Russia designates the Taliban as a terrorist organization, but then they nonetheless come to Moscow for talks because they are such an important part of the modern day Afghan society, whether we like it or not.
Other parts of the important Russia-India ties, when you talk about energy ties, which have increased so much from 2019 summit, when they talked about maritime sea corridors. How do you see that progressing? And of course, there is the international north-south transport corridor where India is trying to get through from Chabahar to Iran and further. How do you see those projects fructifying?
Well, there would be, of course, we're talking about long term, right? So far, we have these pipelines built to China, but even if you look at how they're performing, they're not really supplying this much gas. I think about 70% of the Russian gas exports still go to Europe. But given the current trends, again, something we discussed earlier in this program, that the growing centrality of Indo-Pacific and India in particular, and the growing energy consumption, kind of a need for greater fuel for the economy. Russia, I think, has all the interest, objectively speaking, to be working and investing a lot in diverting its pipeline infrastructure to the countries outside the West and outside Europe. But of course, given that the fact that Russia and India do not have a direct border with each other, these projects are very much dependent on the situation and the security situation, geopolitics, and relations with other countries and security in other countries. So we'll see where the talks on Iran progress, if they do, now in Vienna and further on.
I beg your pardon. You talked about geopolitics and relations between countries. So let me end with this question that a viewer has asked. Abhishek Sharma says, will the China factor be the reason of dwindling relations between India and Russia?
Of what relations between India and Russia? I didn't get it.
Will China play a spoiler between India and Russia?
Oh, a spoiler. Well, I think it very much would depend. Well, frankly, I can see why would the Chinese be worried about, growing relations between thinking, because everyone is kind of thinking about, absolute advantages against their geopolitical rivals. I think what would make both Russia and China kind of trigger is the degree to which India has this rapprochement with the United States. That I think is very much on the Russian-Chinese agenda, kind of a growing, not so much multipolar world per se, as so much greater de-Westernization of the international system, right? Or greater de-Americanization of the international system.
But Dr. Sokol, what would you say
Sure.
about to those who say that Russia is a junior partner in the relationship with China, and Russia is aware of conflicts in even now and in the future, possible conflicts with or conflicts of interest with China? So it's not all hunky-dory. It's only for the present moment.
Well, that I agree with, right? The moment is very important. Secondly, there are some elements in the relationship that we definitely observe asymmetry. I think this image of Russia being a junior partner refers kind of subconsciously to the sizes of economy, right? The Russian economy and the Chinese economy. I think Russia for now has a military superiority over China, and China is actually trying to use this resource to build its own military to stand up to the United States. I think Russian military has to be, and Russian leadership in general has to be careful about this maneuvers. And I also have to say something that I said earlier in this program, that there is this technological factor that makes some policymakers in Russia concerned whether Russia's kind of, pivoting to the east from the United States in terms of technology will make it more dependent on the Chinese technology. That's also a worry. And here I want to draw your attention to that. There was, during the Foreign Minister Lavrov's visit to India, this factor of the need for growing technological cooperation between Russia and India, something that I think goes back to the Soviet times, right? Because both countries have talent, tremendous talent, and both countries, I think India for now is doing a lot better in terms of creating and putting their product to outside market. Russia obviously struggles with the sanctions issue, but also some business models and stuff. So I think there is a lot of factors on both sides that can make this relationship in terms of technology mutually profitable for India and Russia.
Dr. Maxim Tuchkov, again, thank you so much for
Thank you so
coming
much.
on Strat News, and thank you for your insights.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Just a reminder that you can click on the bell icon on YouTube to get notifications for videos like this one. Do also follow us on our social media handles on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram for the latest news and analysis from an Indian perspective. This is The Gist on Strat News Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.